and newsagents.
Do you believe that Hamas must be eliminated entirely?
Yes, I do. But there needs to be a Palestinian Authority. There needs to be a path to a Palestinian state.
It's John.
It's Lewis.
And Emily is not with us this week, nor is Snoopy the dog on her laptop. She is in
Much missed.
Santorini, which is a place where people sometimes, I understand, have stag do's. Did you go to Santorini?
I did for my stag, that's true. Yes, controversially. Although I could totally imagine Emily on a stag. I could totally see that. Her and Snoopy.
I thought we might get more disclosures about your stag, but I think
we'll
that
leave it.
moment
I think
has
you know
passed.
what? I think people have heard on this show enough about my wedding, John, particularly from you and the associated events. So we'll leave that there.
Okay, well, let's get on to grimmer reality of the modern day Middle East, because it is pretty terrifying what is unfolding, what might still unfold, who else might get involved. And there are a number of strands as we sit here at kind of lunchtime on Monday talking about it, where there is a kind of huge, will it open, will it not open on the Rafah crossing that separates the Gaza Strip from Egypt, where aid may go in and Palestinians or other nationals who've found themselves caught in Gaza may be able to escape. And yet, the two biggest players in this, the Israelis and Hamas, are saying there's no deal.
No, and that's despite the fact that Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, has been at various points over the weekend saying that there is a deal and there is going to be a deal, and it's clearly been a main focus of the Biden administration to get Egypt to agree to open the border crossing for obvious reasons. That about 1 million people were told over the weekend that they had to get out of northern Gaza. Some of them have now moved to southern Gaza, some haven't. In the meantime, Hamas, who, as you say, John, has said there's no deal, have been telling Gazan civilians in that bit of northern Gaza that the Israelis are bluffing, that this is fake news, that they don't need to leave. So you end up in a situation where there are people there who shouldn't be. Of course, there is also a question about where they can possibly go. So it feels like you've got that going on in Gaza. You've also what's going on in Lebanon and Hezbollah and continued skirmishes across the border between Israel's northern border and Lebanon. You've had about 20 villages or so being evacuated about 2 kilometres from the border with Lebanon because there is fear that this conflict
These are Israeli settlements,
yes,
where people have moved further south.
Yes, exactly. For fear that at some point over the next week or the next few days that this conflict extends and you start to see another front open up. So and all of the time as well, there's sort of steady drumbeat of war and soldiers who are being amassed on the border of Gaza for this ground invasion that everyone assumes is imminent, is coming, but we can't know exactly when it's going to be.
And all of that time you have got the most intense diplomatic activity, and we saw the Jordanian king in London yesterday meeting Rishi Sunak. We've got Antony Blinken, America's top diplomat, touring the Middle East, trying to shore up opinion. We've also got those interlocutors speaking regularly to the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and whilst you can sort of see America standing by the side of Netanyahu and saying, we've got your back, you must do what you've got to do, but they're really saying, be bloody careful. Be bloody careful about what you do, that you don't inflame things further, that this doesn't spin out of control. And, we talked about Hezbollah in the north, very well organised with a lot of weaponry. We've talked about Hamas, and we saw the grotesque things that happened in Israel last Saturday. Remember, there's Iran as well. And if Iran decides it is getting involved, we are in a whole different ballgame of ghastliness and horror and danger for the geopolitics of the world.
Yeah, and I think actually one of the really interesting and telling things, and perhaps it was inevitable, but telling things that have happened over the course of the weekend is the kind of subtle change in messaging coming out of the White House, but also the British government as well, and other Western forces. Whereas in the immediate aftermath of the heinous attacks in southern Israel from Hamas, the line was almost unequivocal from the Biden administration, which came out full square behind Netanyahu and the Israeli government, between the Labour Party and the Conservative parties in Britain and elsewhere, which was Israel's got a right to defend itself, appalling attacks, almost full stop. What you've seen over the course of the weekend, and we saw it from both James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, and his shadow, David Lammy, Labour's David Lammy, at the weekend as well, is a but, or if not quite a but, then a qualification, which is this line, which is to say, of course Israel has a right to defend itself, but of course we would always expect that Israel, because it's a democratic state, will always uphold the highest standards of international law and so on. And it's notable as well that Biden has been tweeting quite consistently this idea of trying to differentiate between Hamas as a political force and as a, as they would say, terrorist force, and Palestine itself. Biden tweeting again and again and again, we must remember that Palestinians, that Hamas does not represent all or anything close to the whole Palestinian people.
And I think that is good leadership on the part of Joe Biden's part, that you can separate and disentangle these things, because I think that people are seeing this in black and white terms, which it is not. You can support the Palestinian rights to have a safety, to live in security, to have economic prosperity, to have their own state, without having to support Hamas. Hamas is not the unique receptacle of Palestinian opinion. It has been incredibly divisive. They have fought Fatah, the secular kind of old PLO bit, to get them out of
Been no
Gaza.
election for 15 years.
Yeah, exactly. So the idea that Hamas are the legitimate sole representatives of the Palestinian people is ridiculous. And furthermore, it is perfectly legitimate to say that you support the right of Israel to exist within secure boundaries, and saying that Netanyahu has been a disaster, which, in my humble opinion, Mr. Security hasn't brought that much security, and, allowing certain things to happen has been very costly for Israel. And I kind of think that Netanyahu's position, he is hanging on by a thread. And when this is over, and please God it's over quickly without too many casualties, I can't believe he's got any political future.
This is one of the things that's fascinated me most, sort of reading over the weekend about the domestic political situation in Israel. And obviously, in a sense, domestic politics in Israel has now been put on hold, has been put on pause, because there's a unity government. Even some of, although not all of Netanyahu's enemies have come into the government, because this is a rally around the flag moment. Israel's at a potential state of extreme peril, and there's lots of precedent for that. But obviously, all of these questions still remain about, as you say, John, Mr. Security. If there's one thing that the rest of the world, and certainly Israel, thinks of when they think of Netanyahu, it is this guy who has been at the most hawkish of hawkish ends of how Israel should deal with its enemies, foreign and domestic, and Israel's internal security. And yet this thing happens, which completely blindsides the Israeli security state, blindsides Netanyahu. And one of the things that is most interesting, I think, is the connection that is being made within Israel to this blunder, this catastrophe, and Netanyahu's wider political reforms and the state of wider Israeli politics. So there are people within Israel saying, this is a government, which we should never forget is, has really far-right elements within it, the most extreme of extreme kind of political forces within this government. This is a government which has been obsessed with Netanyahu's and the government's reforms to, say, the judiciary, which has been extremely divisive within Israel, which people basically say would mean part of the end of Israeli democracy if it were to happen. These huge protests that we've seen again and again, resistance from all parts of Israeli society. They say that the Israeli state has been weakened by these changes, by this distraction, and the state and the politicians, including Netanyahu, has been distracted, and so completely taken their eye off the ball, this rising threat. So for all those reasons, and as you say, John, it feels as if his political future, when this is all done, is going to be extremely limited.
We have got a hell of a long way to go. And in a moment, we're going to be speaking to Tom Fletcher. He was our ambassador to Lebanon from 2011 to 2015, worked at number 10 Downing Street, advising successive prime ministers on Middle East policy. Tom, I guess in your career, have you seen a moment potentially as dangerous and uncertain as the one we're in right now?
Yes, I have. And often at these moments of tension between Israel and its neighbors, there is that sense that things can escalate, that they can get out of hand. And so I think in 2006, when I was dealing with the Israel-Lebanon crisis, or 2008 in number 10, dealing with another round of Israel-Gaza crises, they both had that potential to escalate. The problem is that even if the various parties don't want things to turn into a regional conflagration, there are plenty of others who do. And that's what we have to be very aware of right now.
When you say regional partners who want this, are you talking about Iran?
Yes. Basically, I mean, I think in a way, for those who want to be a wise friend to Israel, and the UK government is one of those, the thing I would say is, if in doubt about what to do next, take a deep breath and try not to do what Iran wants you to do. And in this case, Iran wants escalation. It wants to undermine this process of normalization between Israel and the Arab world. And the danger is that if Israel drives forward, a bit like America after 9/11, driven by that desire for revenge, the understandable horror at what's gone on and what Hamas have done, that they may end up getting into a worse situation.
Is there, though, Tom, a path where that could be reflected, in the sense that it feels at the moment as if a chain of events has been put into motion that almost feels unstoppable, that everybody kind of knows that the invasion of Gaza will probably prompt a response that could escalate things more widely, but that Israel almost feels that it has no choice? Is there another set of options that, say, the British government could be advocating for, or might be advocating for?
I think there are. And so if I was in number 10 now, I'd be saying, look, let's start with empathy and solidarity for the innocent victims of this. You know, they didn't choose the horror. If there's a gun pointing at a child, then let's try and look to help the child. Then you try to have a kind of hard-headed analysis of the implications and what they mean for your interests and values as the UK, which for me means do no harm, try to ensure that international law is respected, try to minimize loss of civilian life, try not to acquiesce in this sort of Trump-Putin sort of strongman world where international humanitarian law doesn't matter. It's troubling in a way to see some of the politicians equivocating on that. And then, to your point, Lewis, you get stuck into quiet back-channel international diplomacy that tries to actually see round the next corner and not fall into some of these traps. And for me, that means, how do we get the Rafah crossing open properly? How do we get humanitarian aid into Gaza? How do we use those back channels between Qatar, Turkey, Israel, and others? And how do we get all the parties to think about, where does this actually end? We all want to see a moment where we remove this Hamas threat, get the hostages out, without making civilians pay the price for that. And that means thinking, what's a credible government that could emerge in Gaza when the dust actually settles? What I think is missing in a lot of this is, where are the calls to the Palestinian leadership? We should be rebuilding them as an alternative to Hamas.
And just on the situation in Lebanon, is Hezbollah under anyone's control? I mean, yes, they were originally funded by Iran, but the Lebanese government presumably is powerless to stop Hezbollah doing what it wants to do.
Yes, the Lebanese government can't do much to restrain Hezbollah. And Hezbollah actually have quite a lot of margin of maneuver, even with Iran. Look, I don't believe that at this stage, either Israel or Hezbollah want an escalation across that northern Israel border. They both know the dangers of that. Certainly, you wouldn't find anyone in Lebanon who really wants that escalation. They know the danger of going down that track. The US carrier groups, 2 US carrier groups, that's quite a deterrent to have just off the coast there. But there's always the risk of miscalculation between Israel and Hezbollah. There's quite a good level of conversation, level of dialogue between them to try to avoid unwanted escalation. But the risk is always there.
On Lebanon, presumably as well, you've got an economic crisis in the country as well, which again will only make matters worse if hostilities flare between Israel and Lebanon.
Absolutely. I mean, the Lebanese are an incredibly resilient nation, incredibly resilient society, but they've had this series of terrible shocks, and the currency crisis, the great explosion a few years ago, but also this sort of state failure, really, over a period of years since the Civil War. We managed to end the Civil War, but we froze in place a system that doesn't really deliver security, justice, opportunity for the people of that country. So it's already a tinderbox. Remember that Lebanon, 1/3 of people in Lebanon are already refugees from Palestine and from Syria. And so the region, but the rest of us, we do not need an escalation across that Lebanese border. We have to try, as we tried so hard during my time, to keep Lebanon out of the Syria civil war. We now have to try to keep Lebanon out of this conflict between Israel and Hamas.
And just one other thing you've said, which really fascinated me, which was the sort of the back channels with Turkey, with Qatar, maybe others, I don't know. Just describe to us how that sort of operates and whether these back channels have any power, leverage over Hamas in Gaza or the Israelis and what they might do.
So they can be very important, particularly in those moments of unwanted potential tension. So if rockets are fired across the Israel-Lebanon border, sometimes it might be from different militant groups, and Hezbollah and Israel move quickly to identify who exactly fired them. The UN play an important role there, the UNIFIL troops on the border who are there to try and maintain the peace. The Lebanese army, actually, and we spent a lot of time since my period in Lebanon building up the capacity of the Lebanese army to respond and to try to broker off-ramps. Diplomacy is all about giving people ladders to climb down and to climb away from this situation, and especially at a moment when emotions are so raw, when people are so angry, there has to be space in the conversation for those off-ramps, for those ladders to climb down. And that really is what the Brits and others should be doing at the moment. I know it's what the Americans are doing. Tony Blinken is doing on the ground right now. I know it's what the French are doing in Lebanon too. And I think we should be in the mix, trying to be that honest broker.
Tom, do you think that we need to be better at, in terms of our public discourse in the West and political forces in the West, differentiating between Hamas and Palestine and Palestinians?
Absolutely. I mean, the majority of Palestinians do not want this conflict, and they do not want to be led by Hamas. I think what we should be saying unequivocally is that we condemn Hamas terrorism. We condemn violence against innocent Palestinian civilians as well. We condemn the language of dehumanization that's coming from all directions at the moment, and that we stand unequivocally for humanitarian law, the right of Israel and Palestinians to exist, and for the people of the region to have equal rights, to have security, justice, opportunity. We stand unequivocally for humanitarian support and solidarity to the victims of violence, and that we want restraint, de-escalation, a two-state solution. And we can do all that while showing solidarity with those Palestinians under the bombs, with those Israelis who've been so grievously wounded by that Hamas attack. And we can do it all by neutralizing Hamas. If I was involved now in a conversation with the Israeli leadership, I'd be saying, how can we support you to go after hard that list of Hamas individuals who were behind these attacks? How can we make it possible to hunt them down, to bring them to account, but to do that without harming civilians? That way, you keep the world on side, you keep the international community willing to acquiesce in that sort of action. But the action that harms civilians only ends up being counterproductive.
I thought that was so interesting talking to Tom Fletcher, and you can see why a number of prime ministers wanted his counsel. It's an ugly word, but it's an accurate word, when he was talking about the dehumanization on both sides. And it was one of the things that kind of struck me, alarmed me, worried me this weekend, when you had the protests in support of Palestinian rights in London and other cities, and absolutely right, to be concerned about what is happening to Gazans, what is happening in that strip with 2 million people living, the demands for Palestinian statehood, all entirely legitimate, but sort of eliding into support for Hamas from some people who are murderous thugs and behaved atrociously and are misogynistic and homophobic and all the rest of it.
Yeah, and we should say, there were most of the people, I'm sure, who were at those protests would not subscribe to that, and they want to express their support and concern about what might happen in Gaza and what's happening there, which is completely legitimate. I mean, my reflection coming to the end of the weekend, and again, I think that dehumanization word is really interesting and important. My reflection was I can totally understand how it could be that if you were on either side of this, if you were, say, a British Jew or you were a British Palestinian, that you could come to the conclusion that that the lives in this conflict don't matter. So if you're a British Jew, I can totally understand how you could find it deeply distasteful that after everything that happened last week, that it would be now that so many could take to the streets in a way that you could perhaps not imagine in sort of similar circumstances for other conflicts, or after what you would see as a sort of terrorist event where so many people that you probably knew or know someone who knows had lost their lives. And it's just this idea that you worry that there is an element of anti-Semitism behind all of this, and that Israel is always judged to different standards and so on. And I can totally understand that. I can also understand that if you were, say, a British Palestinian, you might think from the initial media reaction and the initial political reaction that no one cared about your relatives' lives, that no one was talking about in those initial days about restraint. And indeed, we heard sometimes some people talk as if there was a sort of almost unqualified right of retaliation. And so this is what I think is one of the most problematic things about this debate overall, which is it can so often descend into what feels like a zero-sum game where nuance goes to die. And it is, in terms of covering it, but also just observing it, it can end up being pretty dispiriting.
Yeah, and that you end up with people picking up the cudgels on social media. You are either pro-Israel or you're pro-Palestine.
And Musk has made this worse with Twitter.
Yeah. Oh, social media has made it infinitely worse, where there is no room for any shades of grey. You can only paint in the blackest of black or the whitest of white, and there is nothing in between. And of course, this is an intractable problem that has huge historical roots, that's based on a series of misunderstandings, is based on a series of suspicions which get worse and worse and worse. And that, the good people who want to make progress on both sides, and they are there, are being drowned out in the cacophonous noise that you're getting from the extremes on both sides. And I think that people who call for just flattening Gaza, there are some on the militant kind of right in Israel, are wrong and need to be called out as wrong. And the people who say the problem is we need to kill the Jews, they are also wrong. There is a way of having a discourse, a civil discourse, even at a time like this, and I thought Tom Fletcher spoke beautifully to it, of the need to de-escalate this, even though it is a time of enormous tension.
But I think it's precisely because that this is an issue which, as we were saying earlier, it all comes back to this. This is an issue which people feel so viscerally often about, sometimes because they've got direct connections, sometimes when they don't. That it can lead you to unfortunate places, that on the left and the right, being as extreme as you can, or being as emphatic as you can about this issue, is almost becomes sort of almost part of your political virility. It becomes part of your, it becomes the way that you express your politics most forcefully, whether you're on the left and right. In the left, that leads you to an odd place, which means that sometimes you can get some voices, by no means all, and often at an extreme, but some voices that would appear to make excuses for and sympathise with a force like Hamas that no one on the left, or indeed no one in decent politics, ever ought to sympathise with. Because this is a political force, Hamas, which is deeply regressive, homophobic, misogynist, and has all sorts of manifestations which no one in the liberal West would ever seek to, or should ever seek to, have any truck with. And that has all sorts of reasons which I think are connected with the way in which the left has come to see Israel very often as basically through a sort of colonial prism, that this is a kind of colonial problem and that they have an anti-imperial kind of element to their politics, and that's how they see Israel. On the right, meanwhile, there is a certain force which has come to see attachment to Israel and defense of Israel as so central to their politics, as almost a kind of a way of seeing Israel as the liberal force, democratic force within the Middle East, and to attach yourself to it and to support it is again sort of part of your political identity. And to be as hawkish as possible on it is a sign of kind of right thinking and good thinking. And the truth is that both of these approaches are absolute high roads to nowhere. And that the only way within British politics and any politics that we're going to get anywhere on this is to leave those sorts of approaches to one side and actually focus on what matters, which is the lives of innocent Palestinians and Israelis, with about whom and in connection to whom they have much in common.
Yeah, I mean, if that description that Lewis has just given of the sort of support from the right of Israel, right or wrong, I mean, it doesn't sound familiar. I mean, go to America and go to some certain Republican conferences on the right and the Christian right, where, you know, one of the things that always struck me when I was reporting from there was that the kind of the love of Israel was immense. I mean, total, huge, can do no wrong.
It's so ideological.
Yeah, so ideological.
Sides. Your side can do no wrong.
But I always thought, God forbid they ever met a Jew, because they probably wouldn't like the Jews, but they quite like Israel. And it was kind of one of those weird things of America that is still very much there. And of course, is a potent force still when America is deciding what its foreign policy should be.
Yeah, it is ideological in that sense. That it's like a lens through which your side can do no wrong, and anyone who questions it instantly has to be seen through the lens of someone whose character is at fault.
Yeah.
And just on the Hamas thing, just to say something I think we don't give enough attention to, in terms of, and again, it's a question for the kind of left more generally, is look at some of the friends of Hamas as well. We should think about that a little bit, which is China and some of the people who've been in the forces that have been in support, or at least not condemning them over the course of the last week. Iran, Russia, China, and everything is often through that kind of anti-imperial, anti-Western lens, and that should give people pause for thought.
We're going to be talking about division again, although it kind of seems small beer in comparison, but actually for Europe, the elections that have just taken place in Poland are really important and significant, and we'll be discussing that next.
Well, understandably, the international community, the world's focus has been on what's been going on in Israel and Gaza, but there have been loads of elections over the weekend, which has certainly been keeping me busy. New Zealand, we had the Australia vote as well, referendum, but the really important one was in Poland, because this is an election that was billed as not just the usual thing, a sort of change of government, change of party, but many Poles felt that democracy itself was on the line. You had the ruling Polish Law and Justice Party, which in all sorts of different ways, it's a kind of populist force, ultra-conservative force, has not only been changing life in Poland, but as far as the EU is concerned, and many Poles are concerned, have been making democracy in Poland itself weaker, and that there has been democratic backsliding, and even the election itself was accused of being free but not fair. Despite that, voting on Sunday, an exit poll suggests that the Law and Justice Party, although it's come first, will not form a government, that the opposition will win, which is huge news for Poland, but also potentially for the EU and Ukraine as well, which we'll discuss. Joining us to talk about it is Jakub Krupa, who's a Polish journalist for MLEX. Jakub, long night for you. It is a massive night though, isn't it? A massive result.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It was a massive night, and I think fairly unexpected, the size of the victory for the opposition, not victory in the literal sense, but the fact that they will be able to form a government with a quite substantial majority for Polish kind of reality. I think that is surprising. Obviously, you've seen that when we first got notifications from the PIS press office saying, you know what, we're not really organising like a proper big electoral night, which is going to give you a statement. That was like first signs that something big is happening. And
so just give people a sense who aren't familiar with it. The PIS, or Justice Party, the Prime Minister's Morawiecki. Why is it that so many Poles, but also the EU as well, find them so objectionable? What have they done in their 8 years in Poland?
So over the last 8 years, they've substantially tried to rebuild Polish democracy. So essentially they said it's governed by the old elites. We don't like the way the institutions of the country are formed. We need to change it. It's all rigged for the liberal elite. kind of a language that you can probably see familiar in other places as well.
It was original in that sense, sort of pre-Trump.
It was very much before Brexit and before Trump, and they obviously cheered both Brexit and Trump in that sense in their first years in the government. And they obviously changed the way the courts operate. The critics, the European Union say they rigged the courts. The courts are no longer impartial. The judges are quite often appointed in a kind of illegal way. Assault on the media freedoms as well. So state media essentially turned into a bizarre propaganda machine supporting the government to the point that I think the last news bulletin before the election was 1.5 hours long, which was like mixed kind of clips between how great the government is and how horrible Tusk was when he was last Prime Minister, and please do remember about it.
And Donald Tusk, who people probably remember from the Brexit negotiations, he was the EU Council President at that time, previously leader of Poland,
That's right.
And he is leading the centre-right opposition force and will likely be Prime Minister now.
That's right. So in that sense, for him to come back from Europe and kind of working on Brexit, he by the way keeps mentioning this. He keeps saying, I've seen firsthand how Brexit unfolded, how the campaign unfolded. You know, we don't want to repeat
nice that we're an
thing.
exemplar.
Yeah, you're certainly being mentioned there.
So there is now a gap, isn't there, between the elections having taken place, just like in America, and the swearing in of the new government. Is there confidence that the Law and Justice Party, which you would think, given their name, they would be very mindful of the law and of justice, will play along and just say, yep, fine, peaceful transfer of power, we lost, we hand over the reins?
I think there will be big doubts about it. I think there's been a number of comments from opposition politicians saying that the cost of shredders is probably going up in Warsaw because shredders to shred papers essentially to get rid of stuff. Because obviously you have a fairly bizarre procedure. I think for everyone following UK politics in particular, you have elections, then you have the new Prime Minister coming in. In Poland, if the opposition gets the task to form the government with Donald Tusk at the head of it, he will not be imposed until mid-December. So that gives whoever is in the current government or in the kind of interim government that will be formed by the Law and Justice Party as the biggest party, even though they won't have the majority in the parliament, and lots of time to go through all the papers and all the things that they've done over the last 8 years.
I mean, you drew the comparison without quite saying it with Trump and, the sort of messaging. I mean, obviously, 2020, Trump loses an election and says he won it. Are we going to see something similar, or has there been any laying of the ground to suggest that in any way the election is illegitimate?
A bit, yes. So, Jarosław Kaczynski, who's the de facto leader of the Law and Justice Party, he kind of conceded. He said it's likely that we will not form the next government. We'll do whatever we can to stop others from betraying Poland. Again, a kind of very loaded language there. But he kind of accepted the fact that this happened. But during the day, and a lot of kind of people associated with the party were kind of undermining the way the voting unfolded during the day. The reason for that is the government kind of built in kind of not only general election but also a referendum on 4 extremely loaded questions about migration, retirement age. Again, questions phrased in a way essentially, do you agree with the government or do you think that your life should get worse? And that referendum, there are some procedural questions about how that unfolded during the day, and there these critics said that's surely the commission, the people organising elections helping the opposition to win. So I think there will be some questions about it, and we have, obviously, the courts need to approve the result of the election. Again, I think something you don't have in the UK. And the courts, as we know, the allegation is, the reality is that they have been changed by the government to be supportive of the government.
But the irony is, of course, isn't it, unlike 2020, which was a fair election, I mean, the whole point is with this is that it was actually being rigged in the government's favour.
Absolutely.
And yet, despite that, with record turnout, highest turnout, over 70%, I think, since the fall of communism in 1989, despite that fact, the government has been removed. I mean, how big a victory, or how important do you think this is, Jakub, for, to call it grandly, kind of liberal democracy in Europe, and also in terms of its importance within the wider EU context as well?
I think it's massive. I mean, obviously, it sends a clear signal in terms of you can defeat populists, you can go in the other direction. And you're right, the extraordinary mobilisation of 73% of Poles, particularly young people, going to the polls and kind of deciding that, yes, we want to get rid of this government, is something absolutely phenomenal. Now, what's going to happen next? I think the interesting questions there are, for this government, it's not just enough for us to say, oh, they are no longer illiberal. The question is, how do you get back from illiberalism, particularly with a coalition that is built with 3 parties of kind of very diverse profile? How do they govern together? How do they agree on things? And also, how do you change reforms that were introduced by breaking the law without breaking the law. So again, you have people like
cleaning up the mess.
There's a lot of stuff that needs to be sorted out then, and that will be definitely a big task.
And Jakub, just let me take you back to the sort of bigger international picture. I mean, the sort of essay question is, what will the reaction be in Brussels, Kyiv and Moscow? I mean, I would imagine in Brussels that's a very simple answer. It's champagne corks,
joy.
relief, joy that that Law and Justice Party has been beaten. But what does it mean in terms of Ukraine, where Poland has been very close, and what will Russia be thinking?
So in terms of Ukraine, I think it's clear that that was one of very few issues where there's a kind of bipartisan all-party agreement on this. However, again, in the last few months, the government and the other kind of opposition far-right party, Confederacja, tried to get some votes on the back of this. So we've had that kind of tension between Poland and Ukraine, particularly on grain issues, and there, I think that's going to change. Clearly, the signal that this government will send is we want to have good relations with Ukraine. We want to build on that kind of positive link that we developed at the start of the war, accepting over 2 million refugees from Ukraine. We want to develop this strategic partnership between the two of us. Now, Moscow, again, I guess depends who you ask. Kaczynski and the Law and Justice, they would say they are very happy with this. Obviously, the long-standing allegation against Tusk is that he's acting in the interest of Moscow in Poland. So that's basically not true, but that doesn't particularly matter for that party. So in that sense, I think Tusk obviously is very aware of what's happening there, and he'll be definitely on the side of Ukraine, I think. I think there's a very clear sense there that, this is just a reset of many relations, but not the one with Moscow.
But finally, Jakub, I mean, within the EU context, it really, really matters for the future, right?
Absolutely.
In the sense that what Poland, if this had gone the other way, the question it would basically have posed to the EU would be, how do you deal with a state that is a massive, Poland's one of the big EU states, absolutely central to the project. How do you deal with one that is either rapidly backsliding towards not being a democracy or is arguably not a democracy anymore? And now they don't have to deal, at least for now, with that question, which means that Franco-German, Polish cooperation can be a driver for the EU.
Absolutely, and obviously one of the big themes of the last few years has been the cooperation between Poland and Hungary as well, in terms of giving each other cover in all sorts of votes in the European Union.
Hungary is now more isolated under Orban now.
Yeah, but they got Slovakian government now to help them out. So there's a problem there again. But definitely Poland will now be coming back to the kind of main fold of the European Union, the kind of mainstream trying to direct things. And I think particularly in the context of Ukraine, that will be a very loud voice there trying to help them out. Again, I think one of the questions that I'm asking myself is, how do they balance the international politics and the domestic politics? There's an expectation of sorting out the state media, the state companies, the lack of level playing field in politics that we talked earlier, the courts, women's rights. There's a very long to-do list on the desk of whoever becomes the Prime Minister, probably Donald Tusk. And international politics will be there, but they will need to strike a balance in terms of how to do that.
Jakub, thank you so much for coming in to talk to us. Thank you. Before we go, I mean, we've dealt with two massive topics, obviously the Middle East, what Poland means to Europe, and now we're going to discuss what Peter Bone, Conservative MP for Wellingborough, means for Parliament at the moment. Another MP who has fallen foul of an investigation into his personal behaviour.
Yeah, so this is long-standing Conservative MP Peter Bone. He's now facing suspension from the House of Commons after a ruling by the independent expert panel, which sometimes assists the House of Commons authorities when investigating an MP. This panel has found that he has, quote, committed many varied acts of bullying and one act of sexual misconduct. All of these allegations Mr. Bone denies, but they are really serious. I mean, allegations against Bone include, quote, an unwanted incident of sexual misconduct when the complainant was trapped in a room with the respondent in a hotel room in Madrid, not knowing what was going to happen next. It was a deliberate abuse of power and indecent exposure. So, and now there are other things as well. Bone verbally belittling, ridiculing, abusing and humiliating a complainant. Mr. Bone repeatedly physically struck and threw things at the complainant. And there are others as well. And if the House of Commons Standards Committee agree with these findings, then he could face a 6-week suspension as per the recommendation, and then he could face a recall petition, loses his seat, and will be looking at yet another by-election, in this case in Northamptonshire seat of Wellingborough.
Is it me? I cannot remember another parliament where there have been
amazing,
so
isn't it?
many MPs
One a
that have
month.
fallen foul of the rules of the House and the rules of decent conduct. Is it that MPs have got worse, or is their conduct held to a higher standard now?
Well, I think that it's the latter, actually. I suspect probably if we had the same standards that we have now, and crucially the same mechanisms to investigate and uphold those standards, and that's been one of the big changes, then I think in parliaments gone by, we would have seen more by-elections. I mean, never forget, it has happened in parliaments gone by, and typically what would used to happen is they would just lose the whip and they'd have to sit as an independent for the remainder of the parliament. A very quietly important constitutional change we had was under Cameron, when this was in response to the expenses crisis, when lots of MPs had done wrong, sometimes criminal proceedings were launched against them, but they were still MPs because there was no mechanism at that time for removing an MP until an election happened. There was a big outcry about that, led by Zach Goldsmith, actually, when he was a Member of Parliament, and they introduced this bit of legislation, a recall petition, which meant that under very specific circumstances, usually connected to an MP's, exclusively connected to an MP's conduct, they could face a recall petition and lose their seat. It is being quietly transformational, because as you say, John, we're now seeing, time after time, this having effect, to the point of even removing Boris Johnson. And in Sunak's case, it doesn't probably matter because his majority is big enough to withstand this stuff. You could imagine in a future parliament, hello, Keir Starmer, small majority in a future parliament, that actually you could imagine a government having its majority whittled away as a result of this stuff in the future, assuming that MPs continue to misbehave, and you've got this piece of legislation which could remove MPs one by one over the course of a parliament.
I mean, we looked at, you look at the John Major government, where he had a very tiny majority that whittled away to next to nothing and depended on DUP votes. If some of the people who'd been caught up in cash for questions and all that whole, imbroglio had been forced out, Major wouldn't have had to wait until 1997 for a general election. We'll be back tomorrow. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.